All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event on mobilizing mHealth innovation for real-world evidence generation. That's a welcome to those of you in the room and a welcome to those of you who are joining us online for this event. We started this project with the expectation that things are going to be changing in both healthcare and clinical and patient-centered research with the explosion of mHealth technology use in the consumer and clinical use space. We're aiming to get in at the start on emphasizing the importance of interoperability and the capacity for efficient collection of real-world data, not only because this is going to transform healthcare in many ways as we move from paper records and episodic care to more comprehensive care with electronic health records, to care that is truly patient-focused, often at home and available all the time because of mHealth progress. We expect research, clinical research and patient-centered research, to change in the same ways. And this event and the activities, the recommendations that we're going to talk about today are about making that happen as quickly and effectively as possible. We see mHealth data as an innovative way to both measure outcomes that are meaningful to the patient and potentially be able to more precisely characterize how an individual responds to a medical product or treatment, using outcome measures that really matter to people, measures that come from the individuals themselves. Because of this, we focused our attention on apps and sensors that are patient or consumer facing, where the user of the app or sensor is the patient or consumer, and they can see and contribute the data that they generate. Because we are interested in real-world data, we're focused on clinical use mHealth apps and sensors. So as you'll see on the next slide, before I say anything else, I want to say that we are very pleased to have had the support of an incredible and diverse working group to contribute time, effort, and ideas to how to achieve this goal of accelerating the use of mHealth in clinical and patient-centered research. You can see the full list of members on the screen here. We have a few joining us with us today in person: Annie Saha, Bakul Patel, Greg Pappas, John Reitz, Martin Ho, Patricia Franklin, Ravi Ramachandran, and Greg Daniel, and you'll be hearing from many of them in a few minutes. I want to encourage you all who are joining us in the room or online to feel free to join this conversation on Twitter. We're using the hashtag mHealth, so hashtag mHealth, and we're going to be tweeting throughout today's meeting. We're going to begin with a conversation with the director of FDA's Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, Jeff Shuren. Then we're going to have two panel sessions with some time for audience questions after each one. We're asking for those of you who are in the room to come up to the microphones that you see in the aisle if you have a question. Keep in mind that this event is being webcast. And a quick note that we're convening this meeting in cooperation with the FDA, and we're looking for as broad participation as possible, including from online. I do want to emphasize as well that the views expressed in the written materials and by the speakers and moderators, and by any of you who comment, are not necessarily those of the Department of Health and Human Services, and nor does any mention of trade names or commercial practices or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. So with that, I'd like to get started, and I'd like to welcome Jeff Shuren up to the stage with me. Jeff, come on up. It's great to see you here this afternoon.
You too.
Thank you. So you have been busy. You and your colleagues at the Device Center have been busy on digital health issues. So it seems like it might be a good time to ask you about the vision that you have for the future of mHealth technologies, both their development and particularly their use in regulatory decision-making and providing evidence about medical products. Any particular issues that you'd like to emphasize there?
I mean, we see mHealth technologies critically important in the work that we do, a terrific source of real-world data, and I think you nailed it when you said the opportunity to measure things that are important to patients, and also to be able to measure things of patients in their daily life. I'll give one example of how important it is. As a neurologist, if I have a Parkinson's disease patient in the office, you're normally evaluating how well they're doing. You ask them how they're doing. You watch them walk in the office. That's not very informative. But if instead, if you're monitoring how they're doing in the home and you can see how active they are in the home, then you have a much better sense of the impact of that intervention on them. And so if we then turn that into truly good outcome measures, we can roll that into better evaluations of technologies and medications.
And as I understand it, this is figuring into the center's strategy for supporting better evidence development, again, not just about mHealth, but about medical devices, medical products more generally through the NEST initiative and the like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Often we think about, you need pristine clinical trials to know what a technology does. Well, if you really want to know what a technology does, you have to study it in the wild, if you will. You need to see what happens in routine clinical practice. And I think mHealth technologies and the whole area of real-world data is about understanding what technologies do when it's being used by people in their day-to-day lives.
And these are not so-called real-world data, real-world evidence. This is not completely new territory for FDA or the Device Center, but it does seem like this is going to become a much larger part of evidence relevant to clinical decisions and regulatory decisions in the future. As I understand it, you all have recently released a medical device development tool approach. Can you say a little bit about that, about how to help make sure that the evidence that's being generated from these devices is really contributing to knowledge, it's reliable, effective, and so forth?
Yeah, so the medical device development tool program and the policy we put out in the program is about how we look at various ways of assessing technologies and those measures, whether they be outcome measures, they could be patient-reported outcomes, assuring that they are, in essence, regulatory grade. Are they good enough that we could rely on them for decision-making? And we put out a framework that's really based upon the context of use, so very fluid in terms of if you're going to use this particular measure, what you need to qualify it may be different depending upon how it's going to be used. And I see a number of these mHealth technologies could be used for generating some of these outcome measures used in evaluating devices.
How's the response been so far? Any mHealth interest or activity? Any early applications that you think would be?
Well, we're just out the door for the MDT program, although we may have our first MDDT qualified tool available fairly soon. So that's a little bit of a pique your interest. But what we have also seen is tremendous interest mHealth digital technology in our complete reimagining of how we should oversee these kinds of technologies to really facilitate innovation, but also have the right safeguards in place for patients.
As a more fundamental matter this year, one of CDRH's goals has been partnering with patients. That's in the strategic plan. mHealth is an important part of that?
Oh, tremendously important, because mHealth gives us an opportunity not only to maybe better understand perspectives of patients when they're out there in their day-to-day lives, but also a way to engage them on technology. And in fact, not just assessing technologies out there, help us in terms of technologies coming to market, essentially create patient scientists. Apple, makes announcements this week, talks about iWatch. We were involved in providing advice to them. And what they're doing, this is really the future. Here you have technology, and essentially it's saying, look, we're providing a feature here, we're investigating it. Do you want to participate? And do you want to help us figure out what this does and help bring this use to market? And it's a great way for now patients, there they are with their technology, sort of saying, yes, I want to do it. I want to be involved and understand what a technology does and help bring the power of mHealth to me and other people.
As most of these product developers are moving forward with their products, including Apple, I would think, their focus probably is first on, how do I provide a tool that's useful to an individual using it? Have you been able to emphasize the research applications, the kinds of things that we're talking about here? So it's not only a device that can help patients maintain their health or manage a chronic disease and the like, the apps, the wearables, and so forth, but a potentially very valuable source of support for new kinds and more efficient kinds of clinical and patient-centered research.
Yes, and I see this as one of those opportunities because, for example, one of the challenges is informed consent in this space. And here's a way of, can we deliver smart informed consent through the technology itself, kind of guide people through its use. and then measure things that are not just the day-to-day improve my wellness, but truly get into people with diseases and improving health. And that's one of the things, even with the watch, can we detect irregular heart rhythms using these kinds of technologies and then sending that information, if you will, to their healthcare professionals. So you know what, if there's an issue, detect it, send it off, deal with it right away. I mean, we're kind of on the cusp of major changes in healthcare as a result.
And there are a set of recommendations coming out of this report. We're about to turn to those in just a minute. You see those fitting into the next steps for your strategy on supporting the advancement of mHealth and digital health technologies?
Well, I do, and I'm going to give a shout out for you too, because you were one of the early people involved in sort of pushing that learning healthcare system model. mHealth and all the things we're doing in trying to have a much more systematic approach in our collection, our use of real-world data, is making all of that vision a reality. And that has huge implications for healthcare generally and in the medical device space. It will change the way we bring technologies to market, how we understand them, and how we have the right safety net in place should bad things, which we hope don't happen, but sometimes they do, how we can identify and address them more quickly.
And moving right along with these transformations in clinical care and patient health that these digital health technologies are also supporting.
That's right.
That's right. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us today and for all your leadership on these issues. It's
well,
great to
thank
see
you, Mark. Appreciate it.
All right. Next, you're going to hear from Greg Daniel, the Deputy Director here at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy, and Christina Silcox, the leader of this project and a research associate here at the center. And they're going to introduce some of our working group members and tell us a little bit more about the new report.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to briefly walk you through the action plan, and then we're going to get the working group members up here to talk a little bit in a little bit more detail. The reason why we did this report is we really feel like we're at a pivotal point in the variety and usability of mHealth apps and wearables. Sensors really continue to improve. Researchers are beginning to understand how to use this data. And we think that this really has the potential to empower patients to take control of their own health. We also believe that that these technologies will be an increasingly important source of real-world evidence, or real-world data to make real-world evidence. And in this case, it's especially important in the case of medical devices because long-term data is really crucial in those cases. And historically, it's really expensive and difficult to obtain. So this project was interested in patient-generated health data collected through mHealth that is patient and consumer-facing. We were also interested in consumer-grade and clinical-grade mHealth technologies rather than ones that were developed specifically for research. And these type of mHealth data can be roughly sorted into 4 different categories. The first one is patient-consumer-reported data, which is data that's reported manually by the person themselves. And then task-based measures, which are objective measurements that test the ability to perform a specific task or set of tasks. And the idea behind this is it really shows what people are capable of. And then we have sensor measurements, and we've divided those into 2 different measurements. These are measurements that measure a person's daily activities, mental state, physiological status, and one we call active sensing. And in this case, it requires an activation step. And by this, we mean something like standing on a scale or doing a fingerprint for a glucometer test. And passive sensing, on contrast, is much more invisible to the person. And so it doesn't really interrupt that person's normal activities. So each one of these 4 categories is really going to have unique benefits and challenges and will require different ways of looking at it. For example, they'll have different metadata that needs to come with it, data that needs to come with the actual data element itself. And one example of this is for active sensing, for example. Did the person take the measurement because it's just part of their daily routine? They have to step on a scale every morning? Or did they have some sort of symptom, and that's why they took that measurement? So when we began this project, we tried to see who are the stakeholders really in this space. And mHealth companies and researchers and sponsors of research are obviously major stakeholders. But patients and consumers themselves are really the central stakeholder because they're the ones who need to use the mHealth and collect the data. So each one of these stakeholders really have their own needs and incentives around this. Patients really want actionable insights, and they also would like to understand a little bit more about how medical products will affect people like them, as opposed to the average person. And they'd also like more information on long-term risks and benefits. The problem with mHealth is currently there's actually not a lot of value to patients. Right now, a lot of mHealth tech returns data, but not how to use it. And not only do the patients not know how to use it, but when they bring it to their clinician, the clinician doesn't know how to use it either. So researchers, on the other hand, should be and are really excited about mHealth data. It's data that's never been available to them before. Novel outcomes, real-world data, longer periods of time, more frequent measurements. I think these are all things that could be potentially be very, very, very helpful. But they just don't know enough about this data. How accurate is it? Do they even have access to it? Are the measurements what they think they are? And has the data been collected in an ethical way that would actually allow them to do research on it in the first place? And then we have mHealth companies. And I think that the benefits of having a research-capable design, there's a lot of them. One of which is simply that if you can do research with your product, then you can use that research to gain insights into your own product that would help marketing and innovation. And then you also can use the data from that device to understand a little bit more about how your customers are using that device. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but patient engagement, behavioral research, in order to retain and attract more customers. But we do realize that the mHealth market is competitive and fast-paced, and so this idea of making your design research capable can't slow you down. So our working group put together several recommendations to pull these groups a little bit closer. 2 of these recommendations require collaboration between stakeholders, and the other 3 are more independent so that any particular stakeholder could sort of put them into practice by themselves. After each recommendation, the working group identified some first steps or action steps needed to get to those goals. So our first recommendation is form a learning mHealth research community. And this would be comprised of pretty much anybody who has a stake in this space. So patient communities, research communities, device and pharma industry, mHealth companies themselves, providers, regulators. There's a lot of people in this space, and I think there's a lot of interest to be part of this community. So the idea behind this community would be to pull together, in a lot of ways, the great work that's already happening. There's so many people doing this work, and we've tried to collect some of these efforts, although it's not exhaustive, in the appendices of this action plan. But be able to pull together the work that people are doing now, find those gaps, and try and fill them instead of being duplicative. And so we see this learning community as having 4 main learning areas. The first is patient engagement techniques. How do we work with patients to design technology that they want to use, that they find valuable, and that they will continue to use? And the second one is clinician engagement techniques. And the reason why this exists is because of patient engagement techniques. One of the major reasons that patients, so at least currently, will stick with an mHealth technology is because they can see their clinician using it and it affects their care. However, the type of information and the type of display, basically the engagement techniques that you use for a clinician are very different from the engagement techniques you'd use for a patient. And so that's why they're 2 different areas, even though one builds from the other. The third learning area is understanding how to determine what mHealth's apps and wearables are fit for purpose. What mHealth tools are useful for different type of study designs, for particular populations, what kind of data quality do you need for that study? And also, how are you using this mHealth data? Some people kind of jump to this primary regulatory outcome, but you don't really need to start there. There are ancillary outcomes. You can use mHealth to do subgrouping analysis, and can we kind of build on that work until we kind of get to maybe that regulatory outcome, at least for some technologies. And then the fourth learning area is methods and tools for using mHealth data, and this is looking at kind of the issues around missing data, biasing, identity management, hardware and software that's changing over time as people are collecting data. There's a lot of little kind of sticky issues that need to be worked through. And then really the most important part of this learning mHealth community is that there be a core group that works to pull together the knowledge that's coming in from these 4 areas. And use that knowledge to be able to identify early high-value opportunities to really direct promotion to, and so that we can start pulling out some really exemplar mHealth technologies being used in this way. The second recommendation is to create a resource that can be used by mHealth companies while they're still in the pre-competitive stage to find standardized, open source, APIs, software development kits, and other things like that would be useful to them. And the idea here is we actually think that would reduce development time and also increase interoperability. Increasing interoperability is very good for researchers. It actually is also very good for the mHealth companies themselves, because as we're seeing, these disparate, single data streams are not that helpful for creating actionable insights. You really are going to need to be able to combine disparate data streams to be able to really kind of get interesting information. Along with that, this guide would include a layman's guide to regulatory requirements and libraries of medical term definitions, data element and definitions, pros and performance measures, and along with also kind of a list of the metadata that would be needed, again, to go along with each data element so that it's actually useful. Like the mHealth learning community, we don't want the guide to be duplicative. And so whenever possible, it should just link to existing efforts. And we have an example of that in Appendix C. The next 3 recommendations are a little bit more independent, like I said. So Recommendation 3 talks about ensuring efficient access to well-characterized, standardized, and robust patient consumer-generated health data. And some of the action steps around this, sort of the baby first steps, are promote and continue standard development through trade organizations like the CTA, and also encourage patient groups and researchers to partner together to really understand how that particular patient group might behave differently to certain mHealth technologies than the standard population might. The 4th and 5th recommendations both talk about something that Jeff brought up, which is, mHealth really opens up the door to some possibilities that haven't been there before, because it allows that communication. So Recommendation 4 is about providing more meaningful feedback of study progress and results. And some of the early steps towards that, trying to make that culture of sharing be a little bit more open and bidirectional. We encourage researchers to send low-risk general information, things like, we finished recruitment, we finished data collection, this study has been published. Even things like demographics, patients would find that interesting. Just to kind of open the door to sort of saying, yes, we're researchers and we know you're the participants and we have a relationship. There's a back and forth there. And along with that, academic journals, it'd be nice to find a way to allow researchers to be able to send the journal articles to the study participants free of charge, because that's one of the things that your average study participant can't get into those journals. And then the very last recommendation is around making participating in research easier by improving informed consent processes and helping potential participants understand how their health data might be used and who it might be shared with. And the action steps around this recommendation talk about using some of these reusable and scalable mobile-ready frameworks around informed consent that already exist. And then also using examples like ONC's model privacy notice for mHealth companies to really give a very clear explanation to people who might be using a particular app of what information is being collected and who has access to it. So this is a crucial time for mHealth. Critical decisions are being made about interoperability, common data elements, data definitions, and again, it's important to kind of get on the ground floor to make sure that these disparate data streams can really be woven together to be able to find actionable insights. And we believe that this will really improve the ability to use real-world patient-generated health data for clinical research and for public health activities. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Greg and the other working group members to give you a little bit more detail.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I'll sit here. Yeah, thanks, Christina, for that great overview on the action plan. I'd like to now introduce 3 of the members of the working group who had a lot of input in crafting the action plan. So if you have any questions about it, start thinking of those now, because these are the guys to, and ladies to answer any questions that you have. So I'd like to first start off by introducing, I've got Ravi Ramachandran, Senior Director of Business Partnerships and Solutions at Patients Like Me. Pat Franklin, Professor of Orthopedics and Physical Rehabilitation at Force TGAR and the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And then John Reitz, Chief Product Officer and Partner at Thread. So I'd like each of the panelists, since you represent a major contribution to the actual action plan, and you represent a stakeholder group in your day jobs that might actually use the action plan, I'd like you to just introduce yourselves and tell us something about what you do in your day job, and then tell us what you think is maybe the most important part of this action plan.
Great. So maybe I can start. Ravi Ramachandran. I work at Patients Like Me. This action plan, I mean, I was really glad to be part of this working group and participate in generating this action plan with some of my colleagues up here. Mainly because this is probably one of the few times that I've seen an action plan come out about mHealth where the patient is the center of this. Because in this enterprise, without the patient or the consumer, everything else breaks down. So unless we focus on the patient, which this action plan does, you know, that's key coming out of this. So and working as I do for patients like me, you know, we focus a lot on the patient. The key learning, I mean, Greg said 1, I've got 3. If you'll bear with me. So patients are the center of the enterprise. The second bit that's coming out of the action plan, which when you read the plan, you'll realize, is we are recommending that you design whatever product, sensor, app, device, that you design with both the heart and the mind of the patient at the core of it. And what do I mean by that? Designed for both getting knowledge, the mind, and the heart, the emotion. The patient or the consumer has to want to use it. And the moment you do that, then you'll get the knowledge. It will flow anyway. So design a product that, you know, the patient won't use, or the consumer will use it for more than the standard 3 months, after which it ends up in the sock drawer. So design a really good product and anticipate or learn from the patients what their real needs are. The third bit, and I'm going to date myself here a little bit, mHealth is sort of at the place where genomics was 20 years ago. You know, it's a cool technology. We're all trying to figure out which part of the elephant we're touching. And if you take a lesson from genomics, we did that. We try to figure out where things are. And now it's part and parcel of everyday lives. Clinical trials of genomics, and there you go to your doctor, you get a genomic test, you get a drug that works specifically for you. That's where digital or mHealth is. It's right there. If we do it well, we'll end up at a good place where we are focused on delivering the right tools and the right insights and the knowledge for patients that is most meaningful to them.
Thanks. So I'm Pat Franklin, and my day job, just so you understand the context of my comments, is that I am a health services researcher, a physician, but I lead a national research cohort of 35,000 patients across the country of 200 surgeons in 28 states called Force TGAR, because it's function and outcomes research of total joint replacement. And that was designed in 2010, before mobile health was really as evolved as it is, or it will become. But we said the patient will provide patient-reported data that will be the primary endpoint of this work. And we did it because, number one, we knew that patients know first the progression of their disease if they have near hip arthritis, pain after surgery, is not a good sign. It needs to be evaluated. And honestly, it's been correlated with failures of devices. So we did this, and we did track all of the other usual suspects of adverse events and important device-related and clinical-related decisions. So that's my experience. So we used email, web, paper, telephone, but we will use apps when they're ready and going. We did use accelerometers. We used research quality monitors of activity, but we'll love it when there's proof of concept that the Fitbit or the other mobile devices can replicate that. So what my key two lessons, I would say, are one from a clinician's perspective. After working with surgeons and clinicians, I know when we reframed this as actually the patient doing the work, they're bringing data to you that you would already ask in your review of systems and your history, and you're asking, can you walk to the end of the driveway? How far can you walk? It doesn't hurt when you cross. We are going to bring snapshots. So we did provide that could accelerate and focus the visit. And so it was actually meaningful to patients and doctors. And that is actually why I'm convinced that patients have been extraordinarily generous with their time in giving these longitudinal data over time. They signed consent for us to contact them annually, indefinitely, and over 80% respond. The second part is the doctors saw value in it. It was usable in the office, and it could focus their interactions. And I think that they'll be open when the data from the mHealth tools can be translated to information that serves those conversations. And then the second part I would say is from the other side. Both the patient and the surgeons or the clinicians in general are being asked to collect a lot of information. So we want to be really discerning in which measures and how can they be used multiple times, right? So can this tell about my pain today or my physical activity? Can it be aggregated into my function outcome measure that's in a new bundle from CMS for total joint replacement? Can it also be returned back or be used in comparative effectiveness research to evaluate the effectiveness of the device? So I guess those would be my pleas, is that as this broadening pool of data emerge, I think there's an incredible opportunity to kind of coalesce around some key metrics that would be best collected through mHealth and then used in research and clinical practice through those multiple ways in the future.
Great. John?
Great, yeah, John, and I represent the mobile health developer clan, I guess, and so I own a company called Thread Research, and Thread Research built a platform that helps provide the patient mobile apps and then the research backend, and then the sponsor backend, so that everybody has an individual experience. So you can actually conduct remote research using mobile apps, devices, and wearables. And I've been in the space for a long time, and the one thing that for me really resonated with what we did in the working group is that that the group that was together was equally passionate, not to like fisticuffs but we were all sort of just passionate about that this needed to be a standard, that we just know that we all are using this. It's the thing that you leave behind even when you would leave your kids somewhere sometimes, right? This comes with us everywhere. And we're like one of the last industries to really take advantage of maybe the most powerful tool at our disposal to change our health. And so at Thread, we're really passionate about that. But I would say the piece for us that's important is how do we pull and stitch Thread, all this together, to make sure that patients have a really individualistic experience and it's in one app and it's just simple. Because I'll tell you that of all the cool things that are available to do, and we can do everything from activities and device-reported outcomes and have you walk around your neighborhood and collect 10 sensors, if it's not simple to do, patients ditch it and move on. And it's actually the exact same principle when we give researchers and sites, and you know this, we give you these tools and a developer develops them, we're like, this is amazing, you're gonna love this. And then you use it and you're like, I have no idea what they're asking me to do. And so what we're not doing is effectively putting ourselves in the shoes of the user, which has been the big movement that we've really had, not just in the world of technology, but specifically in our industry around UX, right? How do we design experience to actually make people want to participate and get value in return, which is the thing we're all passionate about. So I would tell you this group that did this was super fun because it was a passionate group that wanted to see this come to fruition. Now, the two pieces for me that really stood out from the work was, one, we built this implementation guide. Because it's one thing for us to say, here's a bunch of great ideas, knock yourselves out. It was another thing for us to really wrestle and say, how would we give people practical crawl, walk, run steps to do something tomorrow, right? Because we all get lots of advice, but unless someone gives you advice and says, but this is what you should do about it, it's really hard to make something happen. And so the team spent a lot of time in this implementation guide saying, here's some practical things you could do tomorrow. And then I think that the second piece that was really equally important was in this learning community perspective is that we have to be careful, especially with mobile health developers, that most of us run businesses and we have to make money to run the business because that's how capitalism works, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of things that we can do with each other pre-competitively or non-competitively to help each other out. And so what we've done, like in our open network approach, is instead of relying on a digital health company to go build their whole app and ecosystem, we say, hey, you guys are amazing at this mobile spirometry. Why don't we work together, plug it into my platform, I'll do what I do best, you do what you do best, and we can more quickly provide a solution for patients. And what we really tried to push in this action plan was, how could we do that and kind of figure out where people need IP and need to have a business, but how could we really strip some of those and make them more clear so we could work better together? So that's the points I'd make.
Great. I'd like to go back to something, Ravi, that you pointed out, which is, it doesn't help if the patient throws it in a sock drawer. They don't see value in using the technology or the app. We use our phone every day, but not necessarily every app on there. So what are some of the things that can go into a technology that would actually help, this is for all of you actually, that would help a patient either see value in using it or to do something meaningful for the patient?
Right. So I have a phone app, I don't know, at last count I had over 87 apps. I'm a geek, I count things. But of those 87 apps, I use maybe 10 or 12 the most. And why? Because I have a perceived value. When I step out of this, I need an Uber to get to the airport. So I'm using Uber. I'm not using the other 80 apps. So when we build these things, build it with the patient or the consumer in mind. What are they looking for? How can we get data and evidence so that they develop insights and can have a place in the shared decision making? So Pat was just earlier mentioning how you shouldn't be throwing all this data at us. We really don't know what to do. But instead of that, if the patients now come to the table and are sharing in the decision making about their health and wellness, now you've developed a use case for your device, your sensor, your app, whatever it is. So if you can help patients learn and manage and become the CEO of their own health and wellness, I think that's where you'll get the biggest bang for your buck.
Anyone else? No?
Sure.
Sure. I guess it seems obvious that, why aren't the mHealth companies just doing this? Why isn't that step number one in developing these technologies? And you mentioned the action plan. These are things that companies and other stakeholder groups can start doing tomorrow. But will they? And so, I guess going back to the mHealth company perspective, what is going to encourage these companies to take the action plan, read it, and start doing something tomorrow?
Yeah, can I tell you, for me, you want companies, mobile health companies are fast, right? They're really good at just cranking out and doing something. What a lot of these companies and a lot of the people we integrate with don't understand is the context we all have about how to conduct research or care. So they come in and they say, oh, so wait, you have to ask for a patient to consent? They don't know that. And so one of the ways that you can very quickly help is, frankly, just finding a solution and knowing that you're going to have to invest time and effort to help them translate the thing they're doing to the clinical care model or to the research model. So I think that's one of the quickest action steps. The other thing, though, frankly, is when it comes to these technologies, you get to take two approaches as a company, right? One is you can build a tech and say, I own it, it's my thing, and if you want it, here's what it costs. Or you can figure out what your IP is and say, but these elements are how I can take the best in class across an industry and put them together to have a better end-to-end experience. And I think what you're finding, and we're seeing it too in the industry, is that you've got these two companies, they're drawing lines, right? And you're seeing them go. And I'm not going to tell you where I'm going to place my bet, but I'm going to tell you that as Thread, we're an open platform company because that's the thing that's going to get to the market faster to make these abilities happen. But I will tell you there's this in research and in care and all the regulatory standards, you really have to know in depth what you're doing, and you have to be very cautious. We're talking about highly private and secure data, and that's not something that some whizzy app can solve right away. It takes work and it takes effort with knowledge.
And that's actually one of the things that Christina highlighted in the action plan, which is, you know, a simple layman's version of what are the regulatory requirements and how do you navigate those. What about patient groups? You know, we talk about how these can be very useful for patients, and we need to design them in a way that patients would be willing to stick with them. But what can the patient groups themselves do to help improve this and to take the action plan and do something?
Patient groups. That's me, I guess. What can patient groups do? I mean, be the advocate. You know, it's all very well for us to say patients have to be the center of this entire enterprise. But unless somebody advocates for the patients, or the patients themselves advocate for what is most meaningful to their journey of health and wellness, we will never know what is most meaningful unless we talk to the patients, or the patients come up and tell us, this is what is most meaningful to me. It's, you know, let me make it personal. So in 20 years from now, say I'm diagnosed with Parkinson's, or I go to my doctor and my doctor is measuring, you know, the way I walk, my fine motor control, my cognitive. To me, all that doesn't matter. Just tell me, for me, what matters most is tell me how long will I have before my cognitive abilities decline. That's the most. I can deal with not being able to walk, I think. I can deal with not being able to write, but if my brain fails, I'm not me anymore. So for me, that's the most important. So we have to understand what is most important and solve for the right problem.
You know, I would add to that I think that there's been an appropriate emphasis through PCORI and all the funders now to invite and collaborate with patients. And I think that we're learning more about that patients will, as far as my experience has been, that patients are more than available and willing. You ask the questions, you invite them in. They're not just testing the user interface, they're actually telling us what they want us to measure. I would say that some of the things that you're talking about in patient preferences are actually tailored to people, and researchers thinking more than an aggregate, but being able to think of the heterogeneity of people and how to look deeper into what measures for whom and when, you know, are those kind of questions that we can then answer before the tech developers then code it and make it available. So.
Or like I'll give you another instance, because we support a couple of those PCORI, you know, communities. One of the best things we learned was we did that. We built sort of an early version, and we went to patients, and I'll just tell you, we thought this feature is amazing. They're going to love this. And this is how developers work, so I'm sorry, but this is what we do. We build something, we go, this is so cool, why would anybody not love this? And what's funny is the patients used it and gave us feedback and told us something completely different. And we went, oh, well, that's what you want? And we built this like Reddit-style up and down voting of things that were important to the patient, put that in the app. By far, the most used element of the app, the reason people come back in to in a de-identified way, interact with the community in that app. It was the thing that we didn't actually necessarily think was the most important at the beginning until the patients really exercised and told us. And we learn those lessons every day, but I think the trick is, like you're saying, we have to apply them, right? And I think you can't apply what you don't learn.
Right. And what I'll add to this is, you know, we can develop the app, we can talk to the patients, we can do the best research that's possible. But I think Christina mentioned it's in the action plan, I think it's step number 4. We have to be able to provide that learning and the insights back to the patient in a manner that is readily understood. Infographic, you know, break down what you've learned from the exercise. That does 2 things. One, it informs the patients who have actually contributed in many cases blood, sweat, tears, time to our research. And the second bit, if you make them part of the process, then they'll come back for your next research study you want to do and study after that. So because they are part of the journey now.
So let me check with the audience to see if there are any questions for the panelists about the action plan. I think, who is that? Oh, Heather.
So, love the action plan. But I also wanted to think, I I get to say that because I got to be part of it in some ways. But I'd like the group to talk a little bit about the idea that we're not just talking about patients, we're talking about people. Because people move in and out of states of health, and I think it's important for us to start capturing them as they move in and out of states of health. You can take a healthy athlete who has a fall, has an acute episode, might need to have some recovery where the app gives them tools for PT. They're healthy again, they're fine. 20 years later, they're old and they have arthritis, and then we need to support them in their chronic condition. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how we think about people, not just as patients.
Can I talk about that?
Sure.
I think you're absolutely right, Heather. And honestly, the goal of actually a total knee replacement would be that you are no longer a patient, that your knee is pain-free and you're walking and healthier. And so we thought a lot about that with our patient advisors, about how will we find out in 4 years, in 8 years, in 10 years, in 12 years, how they're doing. And we knew we wanted to know two things. One is what benefits, more about the positives, not just, and we in medicine have a tendency to measure the negatives, it's a complication, that's who I see in the clinic, that's who I think about, but we wanted to know what the positives and the negatives. And I think you're really, hit the nail on the head, because patients said, well, you made me reassess, and I remembered where I used to be and now where I am now, and they were people, at the time, and I reuse it when I go to my surgeon to say the trajectory is this way or that way. And so when it's a vocabulary that then can help them synthesize their time, between their health and exchanges, I think it's much more powerful.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Dick Katz from GW Cardiology. Having been in this space on the sort of the ground floor with patients and clinicians for the last at least a decade, I worry a lot about this and where we are in navigating patients and physicians or the rest part of the clinical care team. I give the lecture on the 21st century doctor-patient relationship, and we redefine doctor, including mHealth, pharmacists, all the other pieces to go together. But there's a big tree falls in the forest problem here. It really depends on the patient population, the diseases that you're after. There's so much of mHealth which is really great for the people who don't need it or need it the least, and vice versa. Really hard to get your bang for the buck for the people who need it the most. We, for example, have integrated community health workers in a PCORI project in creating digital navigation to make this better. So there are a lot of things that need to be done now. We've had mHealth around for a decade. Lots of toys, and I find it really, really hard, even with champions at each site, with really good partners, to engage the medical team. Again, a lot of this stuff is just, there's not time. And if you have to look at workflow, we measure patients' readiness for change throughout our studies as well. There are a lot of ways of looking at this that we need to integrate into this, and I'm hoping and sort of getting granular where you go with each of these sections next, because that's the real challenge of what you do with specific populations and specific diseases, because this is, as someone once said about healthcare, more complicated than you would imagine.
Any comments or responses?
I would put a plug in for the clinician constituents, because I think that when what's uncovered in people's records in an app suggests that there's a need for healthcare, this needs to be able to be a vocabulary that would be relevant and know how to translate those words into an actionable medical care plan. And I do think that that the delivery systems are struggling both with how do these data fit into what I have is my current vocabulary of a physical exam and a history, as well as even capturing and processing the data. So we had them in the stakeholders, not as just that, but that it is an important part of it when a person becomes a patient.
Yes?
Yeah, I would just like to throw out some disruptive food for thought, because I really like this initiative. I think it's critical to start putting people together, just even getting people in a room to start discussing problems. And I just want to put out some really complicated questions.
Before you do that, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a pediatric infectious disease specialist, and I've been going back and forth between Berlin and Silicon Valley. Both of them are places that are giving lots of money to develop wonderful tools. But I'm also very strongly a scientist, and I'm very concerned, number one, about the endpoints and whether they're meaningful or not. And I'm very happy that you bring the FDA on board, because I think this is absolutely critical. We're measuring a lot of crazy things, and I think we have to move from pure wellness things to actually critical medical endpoints. And I've always been comparing this to when I was a piano student in high school, and I only wrote down when I actually did practice piano. That was paper, not electronic at the time. But there's this bias that patients are also able to introduce, and we have to be very careful. I think sometimes we need to define endpoints with the clinicians first to see whether they're actually clinically meaningful, and then see how we can work with patient advocacy groups and others to see whether that could be a layman's version. And obviously, being now between Europe and the US, there are different understandings of data protection and data safety and willingness to share meaningful things. And the third point is, and that's always, you know, the pediatricians always get on your nerves by talking about children, but this is a more complex situation even when you have a parent and a child in the room and a physician, or maybe two parents who have different opinions about the health of their child and yet another opinion than the child about itself. The positive thing I have to say, after spending a lot of time working with mobile apps in the pediatric setting, is there really are the digital natives, and they usually take the app or the program out of their parents' hands and start taking the initiative, and that is very much in line with what we're trying to do in pediatrics. So I would like to end with a positive note, that there are a lot of critical issues we need to talk about. And last point is the informed consent, as elegant as it may be to get it electronically, we're also sacrificing privacy in certain settings. So if you use apps in surveillance and it's supposed to be anonymized, we lose some of that data anonymity by going too far with consent. So I think IRBs should also be part of a group thinking about standards, because they need to learn these new ways of doing research as well and be on board with this, I think.
Great. Yeah, do you want to
respond?
Sure.
So I'm going to push back a little. I think patients know best what is most meaningful to them. I'm just going to lay it out there. Yeah, I agree that we should be open, and that's why we had so many people in as part of this working group. We should be open and consultative about talking to everyone within the ecosystem, and we've done that. But I think the patient probably knows what's most. I don't know. I mean, that's talking down to me as a patient, and I think I.
No, I'm not saying that. We trigger in pediatrics our research from the patient and then from the parent. But whether we're measuring an endpoint in a reproducible way or not is something that we have to do with many people.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. But I still maintain that the patient has to be the core, and they probably know best what's going on. But to come to something that you brought up and Jeff mentioned before, as a neurologist, he said, I measure how patients walk in my office, and probably the 6-minute walk test. But you can do the same test with an accelerometer or a smartphone even, and have the patient go out. And then the accelerometer is measuring your movement during the day. So now you can find out the best 6 minutes for each day as the patient is moving in their own environment and not in the artificial setting of a clinic where Jeff is looking at them and they're trying to do their best. So yes, these devices offer you a number of ways to get to those meaningful clinical endpoints, but we're not there yet, because we still have to show that what we're measuring as a best 6-minute walk test using an accelerometer is the same meaning as a 6-minute walk test in the physician's office.
Depends on the field, but I fully agree the patient is at the core of this, because if it doesn't make sense to them, it doesn't make sense to them. But that's completely separate from the scientific proof that I can regulate a drug based on outcome measure X as opposed to outcome measure Z. That's a completely different world, and I don't want to put these in opposition. They actually aren't, but that should be an agreement.
And I would put out there that I think of this as a continuum. of a vocabulary problem. You know, that we were developing an app, and the patients said, this is how I want my steps represented. And the physical therapist said, oh no, this is how I would aggregate these data. And then the surgeon said, oh, I want a monthly high-level trend, right? And so, but that we were talking about the same elements. So in some ways, what tipped the doctor to act, or what tipped the therapist to act, or what the patient cared about was based on a core set of data, and we haven't really worked out the vocabulary of how it would be used across those continuums. And that's what I actually am excited about clinical research, and how we get into that space and look at these measures and think for fit for purpose, and you know, help bridge those gaps right now.
Yeah, so. I mean, and I think you are saying, you know, essentially the same thing, that these technologies can provide an opportunity to measure things in different ways, or to measure more meaningful outcomes to patients, but we do need to have them be standardized and valid, reliable ways to measure what we think we're measuring.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question?
Yeah, my name is Gary Krebs. I'm a professor of health communication at George Mason University. I do research on developing and implementing digital health tools. And I really like your perspective on making these tools very user-centered. I think even more so we need to involve the users in design and refinement of these tools in a very active way through a process of user-centered design. Moreover, I think that the best tools are ones that are going to be invisible, that they don't have to turn on or off, they don't have to implement, they don't have to easily interpret, they just work regularly and are built into all kinds of, thank you. Hope I don't repeat that. They just report data on an ongoing basis over time. The next step I think that needs to happen is that these are not just the data collection and surveillance systems, but they need to be designed to be interactive so that people can ask questions and get advice. And I think the next generation will have health coaches that will help us at times, especially when we are frightened or having problems and can't reach a provider. And so the systems need to be designed to be smart and adaptive and also appropriate, so they communicate in meaningful ways with users.
Yep.
And that's where I think we're going to be going. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Any comments or last?
I got to jump in on this. I completely agree. And I think, frankly, the technology's there. I mean, I can have a chatbot talk to you right now, and you wouldn't know the difference if you're talking to me or the chatbot. The issue is making this, and like you were saying previous, here's how I would say it. There's this clear delineation you can make, right? You can say, here are things that are real-world evidence. They're things that give us insights, but they're not clinically validated measures I can make a scientific decision on. This group of things, you know, and we know what those are. They're fit for purpose. It may be a mobile spirometry for this particular COPD population that proves this endpoint is a secondary endpoint I would give to the FDA, right? And when you delineate that, what I think we have to be careful about, and I see this happening, is people saying, I only want this, I don't want that, right? I only want the digital, I don't want the feel stuff, right? I don't want the soft stuff. And what your point was spot on is that patients don't see any different because they're not the scientists. It's all one for them. And so like when we had an app and it literally flicked on their health app, MyFitnessPal, and everything else, so we could collect this data without them having to do anything but live their life. And then we said, hey, I need you to come in and do this activity and blow into this medical device because that's the endpoint I need. That combination can make things really simple. And I don't want to sound like this is rocket science. It's actually really not. But we do have to think about both perspectives of the user experience and the medical outcomes we need. And if you put this together right, and it's art and science, this really is a space we can nail, and patients do use it and do want it, and I'll show you all the metrics that say that I'm right. So it is true, but but I would say it's a measured journey. So we have to be careful to not at every shiny toy go, oh my gosh, the world's changed now because I can add blockchain IA robots to my app. Right. There is a stepwise approach, right? And we have to be a measured community to do that. And I think that's what we really tried to articulate in the action plan.
I think we have time for one more question.
Well, it's not really so much a question, but more of my third grader. I know the answer to that. So in the report, there is a section that talks exactly about the idea that you don't necessarily need to start off with that as an endpoint, that there is a progression in learning through the process. And I think that that's something that's really important to John's point. So we have these things that are clearly understood endpoint ready for regulatory decision-making items that we could be collecting. But there's a lot of information in that pre-stage that you could build into your development cycle. Like you could start with something as an exploratory endpoint, validate that through the trial process, and then in the post-market space be collecting that as a critical endpoint that's important to patients. So there's a progression there that we need to be thinking about as developers, in that you don't have to start with the gold standard and like I understand everything about this, because we're going to be learning along the way, and the technology is going to be evolving as well. The other point that I'd like to make is I want to be very clear about data standards. It's the idea that just because something is clinically observed in a clinical setting, that somehow that's more valid than a tap test that's taken on a very sensitive phone is we need to debunk a bit of that and start saying that that in some ways some of these mobile apps and technologies will actually give us better, more robust information than we could get in a clinical setting. So.
The only plug I want to make here, too, because I think it's important. So let's look at the last 5 years doing this. We know patients and communities have gotten on board, researchers 100% on board, companies who want to fund these services on board. Now we have individual groups in agency. We have what McCool's doing, the digital health group, and sort of the innovation review. You've got what Nest is doing. You've got people in agency, in regulatory spaces that you can talk to and say, I have this idea, or can I put this through a model? That's not stuff that we had readily available in the past. And I think what we really tried to nail in here too is to give directional arrows to people to know this stuff exists, you're not on your own, right? And so I think it's our job, because you've heard it, it's your responsibility now, it's my responsibility, that we have to make sure that people in our community understand what is available to them, so we don't, sort of, by not giving information, enable these people to make mistakes, right? That's really for us.
Great. Join me in thanking the panel. Excellent comments.
Okay.
We'll now turn things back over to Mark.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank the panel as well. So you've heard an overview of the action plan on mobilizing mHealth for real-world evidence and research applications. And you've also heard the start of the discussion with some of the perspectives on how fit for purpose the different kinds of mHealth data might be, and how they can be used effectively in specific applications. And that's really the focus of this second panel, our last panel for this afternoon, perspectives on fit for purpose of mHealth across the healthcare ecosystem. This is our final session for the day, and you're going to hear from a range of stakeholder perspectives who have been involved in developing this action plan about the use of patient and consumer-facing mHealth across the healthcare ecosystem. And my microphone is apparently it looks like we're going to have to maybe sub out a minute, or is there do you have a handheld? Let me use the microphone here for a moment while we're getting the handheld up. But this was introducing this next panel as we move from an overview of the action plan on mHealth applications in real-world evidence generation to a discussion about fit for purpose. This came up in the comments in the last session, and we're going to hear more about it right now. So I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists this afternoon. It includes, and please come on up, Rachel Florence, the Executive Director of the new Nest Coordinating Center, Cindy Grossman, Associate Director within Science of Patient Input at Faster Cures, Martin Entwistle, the President of Aries Health Systems, and Allison Campbell, the Global Head of Patient-Centered Outcomes Research for Oncology at Genentech. So very pleased to have all of you here. I will sub over to this other microphone right now. As you all heard, we're good? Good. One of the main ideas in the action plan was that there is an intersection of stakeholder needs, interests, value. We heard about that from John and others, among patients and consumers, among the mHealth companies, researchers, clinicians, sponsors. Since we've got a lot of these perspectives represented here today, I want to start with that. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Rachel. You're the Executive Director now of Nest. First of all, what is Nest for people who may not be familiar with it?
Is my mic working? Yes. Okay, good. no device failure. So NEST is the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. It's a fairly new organization, but the idea of NEST has been in the ecosystem for a number of years now, probably about 10. The idea is to really accelerate the collection of real-world data and the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices, for imaging technology, for diagnostics. So part of the reason that I'm really interested in mobile health is in the sort of the increase in real-world data, potential use for generating robust real-world evidence, but also the streamlining of clinical research, because I think we talk a lot about the potential for increasing data in the ecosystem, but there's a real possibility here and a real transformational possibility in streamlining how clinical research is done with increased patient participation and engagement.
So it's a great goal, and this is actually an area where you've been working for quite some time before NEST, working at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute on helping to get off the ground a network to use electronic record-based information and other sources of information more systematically. And I think we have a microphone issue, but let me go ahead and, if you want to hold that, or I can hand you this one. I just wanted to follow up on what you see as some of the biggest challenges in this space, especially as you heard about earlier. A lot of the mHealth applications are really going to get off the ground if it's possible to integrate data, to link data from different sources. So you've had a lot of experience with that. Any insights that you could share?
So it's definitely early days in the mHealth space. So I think it's sort of echoing what our questioner earlier, just saying it is early days, and I think we have to be careful about a lot of the sort of the drawbacks and sort of remember, sort of put on our scientific hats as well to sort of remember that a lot of data generated is not actually going to be that useful. And we see that a lot with electronic health records and claims data. A lot of that data is generated for very specific purposes, and it's not easily usable for research. However, I do think there's some disruptive forces at play, and I think they're positive disruptive forces. One is the cloud. I think the cloud has really transformed our ability to do linkages of different types of data sets. And for epidemiologists, that's gold because we can now do longitudinal research. So it's not all out there yet. It's not turnkey, but really there's been a real acceleration in that potential with the cloud. And then the second is, I think, the sort of the coming of age of mHealth. I mean, I think both because of the potential of the data that's generated, although I do agree that we're in very early stages, but also because of the streamlining for clinical research. So being able to do electronic consent, being able to follow up patients electronically without having to have them come into the clinic and have someone hired to actually sort of manually write in their sort of their follow-up. So all these forces are at play. I will say, just to finish my comments, that first iPhone 2007. So 2017, we have the first generation going to college. 2000, so another 10 years, 2027, that first generation is going to be out of medical school. So that's when I think we're really going to sort of see the exponential sort of payback for sort of this world. Right now, I think we're still in the very early stages, and some of us generationally are struggling with the technology.
Not yet fully aged in and
That's
integrated.
Right. Yeah.
Well, in terms of perhaps hastening this process, Cindy, as we've talked about all day, mHealth really seems like a key to making research truly patient-centered with the kinds of outcomes and engagement that can lead to some insights that are just not possible through other kinds of clinical-based data sets and traditional research data sources. But that also means that patients are absolutely at the center of this. So unless they're willing and interested in contributing their information, their data, and we've heard earlier about many of the challenges and concerns that exist with lots of data that's out there now that really isn't all that informative, certainly isn't valid, reliable evidence. What do you think are some of the concerns, the issues that would help patients see real value and have real confidence in sharing their data in mHealth applications?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's really an important one. So let me back up and say that I work for Faster Cures. It's an organization here in DC. We're an action tank, and basically we're focused on looking across the system and to accelerate the medical research system and to move products to market quicker and to make sure that they're available to patients. And at the center of that, our work is really focused on ensuring that patients' perspectives are front and center along that whole trajectory. And so we were actually funded recently to do a PCORI Engagement Award, a Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Award. And what we found by surveying patients and caregivers, over 700 of them, really boiled down to two, I think, key elements that actually haven't been talked about yet, and that is trust and transparency. So the first is, who do patients and caregivers trust? They trust their providers and they trust their healthcare systems. They also trust patient organizations. So someone asked earlier on the earlier panel where patient organizations fit into this. And I think they're a key trusted party for a lot of patients and especially for caregivers. And so if there's not that trust for mHealth companies, sort of where does mHealth fit into, and where does the industry of mHealth fit into that trusted partnership and relationships, and where do they align? Are they aligned more with those trusted parties, or are they aligned with parties that we found that have less trust in the system, like insurance companies and payers, and also the medical device and pharmaceutical industries? And so I think we have to think about how to build trust across the whole ecosystem in terms of patients. The other piece is transparency. We asked patients and caregivers if they knew, if they could find out how confident they felt that they could find out where their data was shared and with whom. And I bet most of you who are smiling right now get the answer to that question, which is for most patients and caregivers, it's a black box. And if we have that level of transparency, how are we supposed to build trust? So if we know that trust and transparency by a lot of PCORI's work are key tenets to patient engagement, and we have such low levels of transparency and we have a real trust issue to solve, I think that those are key challenges. They're solvable, but we all need to kind of, I think, attend to those issues as we're talking about creating apps and mHealth that people will want to use.
Thanks, Cindy. So appreciate the perspective from patients being actively engaged and supportive of this effort. Martin, I was going to ask you to say a little bit about what it is that you do and where you come from with the work at Ares, but I'd like you to talk about some of the other stakeholder perspectives on this, since you've seen a number of them. How can we, what do you see as the opportunities, the challenges for everybody to see value in this approach?
Thank you. Well, much of my experience I'm going to talk about is from work that I did with Sutter Health, large integrated delivery system in Northern California over the last 10 years, and I'm now out on my own, but experience largely comes from that. And about 10 years ago, I guess, we saw the writing on the wall of the need to move to a different model of care that would require greater engagement of the individual, greater understanding of how well an individual is doing, and have that as part of day-to-day delivery of care. And we started with a program was supported by an ARC grant, so involving research in diabetes. We thought we were pretty clever. We were using technology that you would now find in a computer history museum. We had a Trio phone. People remember the Trio phone? I think I saw you use it. No, it's a BlackBerry. We connected up Bluetooth glucometers, single-point glucometers, and it kind of worked. We got data back. We got insights. We ran this as an RCT. We got improvement in outcomes, which weren't sustained, and it caused us to think a lot about the start of the process that technology alone is not going to solve these issues. We moved on and evolved the system and then applied it for hypertension, and we did a pre-post study in hypertension where we put a lot more effort into a much bigger surround to the program. How do you keep people engaged? So one of the issues is not just technology, you got to think about how we keep people interested, including the physicians and teams. And a comment's been made about the importance of being shown that the data collected is actually being used for patient care. We've certainly shown that that's really important. But some other interesting insights. I'll speak a little bit to a few things because they relate to the previous panel's conversation. So in our hypertension study, for example, you'd imagine what outcomes we're measuring. Well, clearly systolic diastolic blood pressure. And the only validated values really are office-measured blood pressures. Well, we really wanted to manage the patient based on home BPs. What do you do? Well, we used what the literature advises is apparently the target to go for, 135 over 85, but actually no one knows. So you start off with a problem. How do you get buy-in from the physicians when you don't have the same level of validation? And so we got pushback, you can imagine, but we pushed through that. And what's interesting to the comments that were made before, what the physicians got to realize is that they got a different dynamic and dimension in the data. What they got to see was less about the absolute value. Is the patient at 135 or 85 or whatever their personalized goal was, and they saw trends. They'd never been able to see that before. So they saw patients that were running nocturnal raised BPs or evening raised BPs, and now they could change their management. So I'm a great advocate for encouraging us to be a little freer with the use of the data than we might just if we apply hard science, because I think there are some really good insights that we can learn. So in that way, we can then get engagement. So physicians particularly are understandably concerned about this whole direction of travel. They're concerned about the scientific value. They're concerned about inundation of data. So we have to think very carefully, and as we develop these systems, again, it's another plea for an understanding of what the users really want and value and not make assumptions. And we have to make sure that we truly add value in the process and remove some of the pain points. We also, I'm sure no one in this room is going to make the mistake, but I do see it quite a lot, that when we talk about clinical practitioners, we immediately jump to physicians. And I've done it myself just a couple of minutes ago. We need to think about the opportunities for distribution of care management processes across the care team that can, go through nurse care managers, nurse practitioners, coaches. There are a range of people that we need to be thinking about how we engage in this process, obviously, as well as the patients, because there are huge opportunities for redistribution of work and retraining. But I also think, I just want to bring out another point. I see that we're really facing an opportunity for disruption of healthcare. We're partly having this debate because individuals are behaving differently as consumers of healthcare and are making different decisions that have got not a lot to do with our core clinical systems. How do we engage that energy? How do we think about bringing together the consumer health ecosystem with the clinical health ecosystem? And how do we research and learn how to make best of these opportunities? So that's a plea for doing more of this research and practice, building on the real world experience, those opportunities, which is more subjective maybe, or economic or social science type research than typically we're used to in the clinical field.
Great concept for integrating mHealth with research. And Allison, as in your work in directing health outcomes research, I'm sure you've spent some time with mHealth data already. I know you're actively involved in thinking about what's next. So what are some of the next practical steps for making mHealth data useful and fit for purpose in the research context?
Oh, thanks for that question. I'm going to make sure my microphone's working, given the way the day's going. Okay, great. Just to give you some background, I'm a social scientist who's worked in outcomes research for 11 years. And what I think is most exciting about mHealth is even 5 or 6 years ago, going to a science meeting and talking about hearing what patients think, there'd be 3 people in the room. And so it's pretty exciting to see all the enthusiasm through patient-focused drug development, as well as the growth of mHealth technology, much of probably because of Silicon Valley disruption, and really prioritizing what patients, or even really individuals using type of any mHealth research think. When we think about, what does the future look like? As a health outcomes researcher, I'm very interested and focused in cancer and really understanding how treatments impact patients and what tolerability looks like. Because if you could think about some of the most difficult and important healthcare decisions any of us might make, the choice of treatment after a cancer diagnosis is one of them. And given the number of new drugs available, patients are at a time when they have unprecedented choice. And so we're really interested in using the patient-reported outcomes version of the common toxicity criteria for adverse events in clinical trials, as well as in the real world, as part of the electronic medical record. And I had a really great piece of research come out at this year's ASCO meeting, and for those of you non-cancer people, it's okay. It's the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and Dr. Ethan Bosch's plenary talked about how at Memorial Sloan Kettering, they had randomized almost 800 patients to 2 groups. And for those of you who aren't in cancer, Memorial Sloan Kettering has fabulous outcomes for their patients already. And the reactive adverse event monitoring group looked at patients reporting their adverse events to their physician at a visit or calling in between visits. And then the experimental group looked at patients who would fill out 12 items from the PRO CTCAE, a patient-reported adverse event, using a web-based portal or an mHealth platform. And when they reported a severe adverse event or worsening, the email alert triggered a nurse who intervened in their care. And so you can imagine that those patients probably had better health-related quality of life, but what was really stunning was that the patients in the experimental arm had 5 months increase in their survival. And so as an outcomes researcher, to see that just something as simple as using mHealth to ask patients about their symptom, to improve the monitoring of their side effects. These patients probably were able to stay on chemotherapy longer, remain functional longer, which we know increases survival, could do something like increase overall survival by 5 months, to me is really profound when we think about where mHealth is going. Because I think as a researcher, having more reliable technology to make decisions is going to be extremely important, and also just getting better context. I was really excited to hear the comments from Thread, because in particular, I think right now there's a lot of potential for things like functioning to use technology, but unless we have that context data about where you live, weather, built environment, there's too many variables we don't know about to draw meaningful conclusions, as a couple of folks have brought up. And so I think in the future, the harmonization of health clinical outcomes, the patient's perspective, and technology coming together to give us really high context information to make decisions, I think will change clinical trials and really has the potential to increase care the way a simple intervention like asking patients about their adverse events using mHealth did.
Thanks very much, Allison. So, Rachel, we've talked about some of the challenges and practical opportunities for moving mHealth forward in research. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how mHealth is going to be relevant, or how you think it might be relevant to the NEST work that you're engaged in now, which is really a big part of the future of medical device evaluation and evidence.
So I think mHealth can contribute in a number of ways to NEST. So one is in the generation of real-world data that wasn't collected before. So I think we've talked about PROs, we've talked about sort of different levels of functioning. We've talked about sort of just, I think the rest of the panel have sort of made that mention. But I think there is an increase of availability of that data, notwithstanding the fact that some of that data is not going to be useful, and we have to be careful about what's usable and what's not usable. I think that in terms of sort of mHealth tools for streamlining clinical research, I think there's a real potential there for NEST, because we really need to remember that at the end, what we're looking for in terms of regulatory needs are robust studies. And so whether they're observational or interventional, mHealth really provides sort of a big leap, I think, in terms of being able to generate faster research results, higher quality research results, and also possibly less costly research results. So I do think that mHealth really has a big potential to play in this generation of real-world data, real-world evidence, but it is early days. So we're sort of the pioneers in that world, and I think it's exciting, but we also have to be careful about what's possible and what's not possible, and remember that we're working with patients here and patients' lives and patients' quality of life, and we have to be mindful of that.
All right, well, we'll stay tuned for next steps at NEST. And Cindy, kind of a similar question to you. Maybe you could you talk a little bit about how you see mHealth data, patient-generated data, affecting research and care, some of the next step opportunities?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's an opportunity, as everybody has said, to sort of transform research and care and give us new understandings and trends and all of that. But I also want to say that there is there's a science behind the way in which you engage patients, and there's a science of patient input. And patient engagement is more than participation in research. It's more than the consent process, as I think the action plan highlights. It's sort of the first steps might be involving sort of informed consent and feedback to patients, but there are other levels. And I think that the good news is that there's actually a platform of trying to think about patient engagement that mHealth could build on in research and apply that. Obviously, PCORI has done a lot of work and to set up principles of patient engagement. The Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is also has a great model for patient engagement in clinical trials. And so I think the question for how patient-generated data will transform research really has to do with how well do you engage patients from soup to nuts, from designing the trials all the way through to interpreting the results. And so patients really need to be engaged not just in the device and their interaction with the device or your interaction with research, but all the way through. And I think that there are also some research questions that we could ask through mHealth about patient engagement that I just want to flag. One has to do with, we hear a lot about patient burden or provider burden. Can mHealth help us understand what's the tipping point between being engaged and adoption of a mHealth tool, and what causes one to sort of put it away or remove it or not use it? I think we could gather some of that information. That would be really valuable to help us understand where to draw the line in our research. And then I think we also need to understand there's this feedback loop, and I really applaud the action plan for putting that out there, that there needs to be this bidirectional, ongoing relationship between research and patients. But the question, I think, is how much information is useful for patients, and what level of engagement and what level of feedback are patients really looking for? And I think we could learn a lot about that if we were to implement some of those phases of the action plan.
Great, thanks. Now, Martin, you've talked some already about your experience, including experience with some mHealth-related issues in research and clinical care. Maybe you could maybe say a little bit more about that and some of the implications for the next steps for mHealth.
Yeah, and similarly, I have enjoyed reading the report it's put out. I think it actually advances discussion quite significantly. It's a very useful framing and brings some great points up. Some of the challenges that I think still exist, we need to recognize that there are technical challenges. I actually don't think the technology is the biggest barrier to progressing. But for example, we've all probably had the problem of trying to get a device to pair with a smartphone. So practical technical issues can get in the way of us advancing these kind of programs. Economics, who pays? In a research environment, it's maybe somewhat easier if you've got funding to provide devices for a particular program. In the real world, how do we deal with that? We still don't really have the revenue models for care that support devices. And therefore, are we going to bias? It's only certain types of patients that can be using these. So I think there's some challenges we need to recognize, and hopefully, policy can help advance over that. I also think we should be thinking about the future and where we're going to. We've already had examples with the data. We collect it for one purpose. Down the track, we may well want to use it for another purpose. And without overcomplicating things, unless we attach certain metadata to that data we collected, when we go back later and want to use it for other purposes, we're going to struggle. I'll give you one example. It's just simple but practical. We're collecting a lot of mHealth weight data, most of it coming out from people who are trying to improve nutrition, weight, etc. But you might be collecting weight as part of a heart failure program. And probably when you do, you're going to have a greater level of specificity about it because the actual weight really matters. You're going to use it for management. So if we put all that in a data lake and go back, next year and want to review our weight data, then we're going to find that some of it actually has a higher level of specificity to a particular program and greater value in use. We would only know that if we've attached some kind of matters to it. So I think we need to think through some of those issues. I've mentioned a little bit about, I think, the very significant value of big data analytics. I think we've got to apply it carefully, but I think there are many things that we could learn out of it. One thing that interests me is we see it in oncology, is tailoring interventions to particular patient profiles. And I think we have the opportunity to do that in chronic care management. we tend to put the patient into the intervention that suits us best, me as a practitioner in my experience. What happens if we could jump to the third thing on my list is the best thing for you? So better understanding how we tailor management to particular personas, profiles, etc., to me is one of the exciting opportunities that could come out of wider use of this kind of data.
Very interesting. And Allison, as you alluded to earlier, you are involved in a number of efforts around trying to understand fit for purpose in this space. And this is a theme that's come up. The title of this session is a theme that's come up in the comments earlier. Can you talk about how you see the recommendations in the action plan matching up with these efforts around fit for purpose use of mHealth data?
Sure. No, it's a really great discussion. And actually, I think earlier folks were talking about this idea that, there's a benefit for tech to collaborate pre-competitively. And I think if you look at the analog of clinical outcome assessments in pharmaceutical industry and biotech, one is you have a really great framework for how to create an endpoint that measures something reliable. And also you have a really great analog about the value of pre-competitive collaboration. And so just to break down what that looks like, when we come up with a new clinical outcome assessment for a study protocol or a design, the first thing I think about, or someone on my team thinks about, is what is relevant to those patients as an outcome of interest in the trial as it's designed. Then you think about what would be an endpoint. Ours, of course, are acceptable to a health authority, but we also do exploratory endpoints, as was recommended with new technology. What would be the endpoint that would be acceptable to measure that? And then you think about, what would be the tool or technology to do that in the most rigorous and reliable way with the least burden on the patient. And so you could think about there's areas such as, asthma. If I wanted to do a sleep diary on interference with sleep from my asthma, it's quite burdensome for a patient to get up every day and fill out a sleep diary. If there was a way to do that passively, that would be a great way to get that information. Now, do I think mHealth will solve, any problems? If I were to kick my colleague in the knee, and I promise I won't, he would still be the best proxy for his pain. I don't think an mHealth device anytime soon is going to tell me what his knee pain is. But I do think that clinical outcome assessment framework, which actually has a very clear regulatory path forward, is a great analog to use for mHealth. And that's the way we've been thinking about it when we want to start incorporating it into clinical trials and clinical research. And as many folks said today, I also think it's really important. We have a whole division in our group called Strategic Innovation that does a lot of experiments with this types of information. And we're doing a bunch right now to figure out, what gets to that fit for purpose that we might want to include it in a clinical trial. But for the learning community, which I was really excited about, we've actually been in some discussions with folks at Citi to have the folks like me from the measurement community who like things like psychometrics and lots of statistics talk to some of the tech folks about how do we take this measurement strategy, this measurement science that we use with the FDA and start applying it to technology and working together to create a real digital health endpoint advisory group. And when you look at the learning community, I think it's exactly what we need right now, because I think as the folks on the earlier panel really well elucidated, we've done I think a lot of the work and the knowledge is there. It's just about assembling it in a way where the right people can have it at the right time, and we can really partner well to move it forward. And so I think you're going to see a lot of synergies, I think, in the years to come from traditional clinical outcome assessments and mHealth, and really improving care in a meaningful way, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to measure relevant outcomes of interest for patients that are going to be important for medical decision making.
Great. Thanks for that answer. Very practical approach to what fit for purpose means in the mHealth context and how to get there. We do have some time for questions and comments from those of you who are here. So I encourage you, if you do have a question or comment, to go to the microphone. And just as we did before, please identify who you are before you ask the question.
Yeah, thank you. I like your last comment, Allison, about the honoring the subjective perspective of the consumer. Seems that we are more focused with a lot of devices on measuring the biologic, aspects, because they're very objective, but they don't really reflect often the individual's perspective. And pain, for example, is very subjective. So I think that we need to, there's both software and hardware issues I just wanted to mention. In the software, I think we need to integrate both the subjective and the objective, the biomarker data along with the individual assessment, and somehow come up with a meaningful measure of what that means. But I would usually give preference more to the individual's perspective because they're the ones that are the end users. From the hardware perspective, I think we need to start thinking about ways of delivering mobile health in more invisible ways. Most people who do mHealth think about the smartphone as the carrier because it's a pervasive device and it has a lot of potential. But it's still kind of a clunky way of delivering information and collecting information. And so now we've moved to wearables like watches and glasses and clothing. But I think we start thinking about ways of building it into our environment, into smart homes, into smart cars, into our offices, into places where we congregate. And I think we need to start moving into kind of a more of a bionic understanding of building it in, implanting chips into our own bodies so that they're truly invisible, and also we'll be able to collect data in a much more systemic way. And some of the people at the MIT Media Lab are doing work in this area right now that's really exciting. And I think that in the future, the mobile health will be even more built in than it is now, and much easier to use because we won't have to turn it on and off. It'll be available wherever we go. The trick will be to design those systems to be comfortable, to be acceptable, and to work effectively over time. Thank you.
Comments on that? Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
I'll just say a few words. I mean, I think these are great ideas. I think they're a few years away, and certainly sort of for some of the immediate needs that we have. But what your comment sort of triggered for me is remembering health disparities. And I think in parallel from all the great work that we're doing in innovation, we have to be collecting empirical data about whether we are or not reducing or increasing health disparities. I mean, I think there's different schools of thoughts out there. There's different theories out there. But I think it's incumbent upon us as a community to make sure that that we are collecting empirical data on the effect of mobile health on the health disparities as well.
And even better would be if mHealth technologies can make it easier to collect data from sources that can be challenging and representation that can be challenging in traditional trials. Any other comments about built-in mHealth or steps to help make mHealth easier to use? Yeah.
So it interests me. How many people have got an Alexa or similar right now? So there, for example, is an area that I think is going to be disruptive.
About a third of the room or so?
Yeah. Small now, but think of the potential. Now, maybe this is a plea for the learning environment that's proposed. Because think if we could short-circuit how we might make best use of that. I mean, I know a lot of people would have concerns about that kind of device. It's listening. Do we want to encourage patients to have it? How do we use it? Think of the potential, say, for the older population or people with disabilities that have difficulty with some of the devices. So I think there's a lot of potential if we can manage the risks. And if we learn fast by sharing experience of where it works and where it doesn't, I think there's an example of how we might move these new technologies into use faster than we have historically.
Interesting.
I'd just like to say just something about privacy, security, and kind of data control and ownership. And, I think from some of the work that we've done and others, patients want to at least have control over their data, even if they, on a legal front, may or may not own it or be considered to own it. But sort of data control and where the provenance of data lies, and then who is responsible for security and breaches of privacy. And I think that's not restricted, obviously, to the mHealth world. That's a larger conversation that certainly applies to mHealth. And again, I think trying to think through what patients are concerned about in terms of privacy and security, and not necessarily making assumptions that patients want a certain level of privacy and security, and certainly not overpromising, are all key considerations.
Yeah, any particular promising steps or directions that can help build up that confidence in control as we get to much more rich and personal sources of data and research?
Well, I do think that some level of transparency, being able to see where the data goes, being in some sort of control of the data from a patient and caregiver perspective will help to build some trust in the system. Another analog that actually Faster Cures has been looking at, because we have a sort of financial arm to our organization, has been looking at the banking industry. And they have a consumer body that now is trying to look at data privacy and security, and is experiencing a revolution in terms of where data goes and who has access to it and how it's controlled in the system. So I think that's a nice analog potentially to look at other sectors that also manage a lot of data that they need to keep secure and private.
Yeah, still working through some issues
Yeah.
there. Next question.
Yeah, Dick Katz again from GW. When you talk about some of the things like disparities and the different subgroups of patients and the impacts we're trying to have, as I mentioned earlier, having my focus in mHealth the last decade with predominantly Medicaid patients, one of the biggest gaps and areas where I think mHealth can have some interplay is on the social, in the social determinants of healthcare. It's often, almost entirely left out of mobile health. And to have your impact, to get that patient engaged, I don't know how many minutes today I spent in clinic adjudicating medications, but the need for that and for that population in particular, or a range of populations, is really great. And there are a lot of things that can be connected with the patient that are really mostly just focused on technology and other clinical endpoints rather than that.
Any really promising steps in that direction that you're seeing in your own work or your own clinic?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we use community health workers and as digital navigators, and we'll get the community health worker to start with the patient, then we'll add the mobile. Then we'll pull the community health worker back as a digital navigator, observing and helping with the patient and bringing that person back in. But you almost need like an e-social worker and all those. You were talking about the healthcare team, and that's why I redefined the 21st century doctor-patient relationship. You've got to be a little more creative about that healthcare, and you ought to look for problems when it has to getting access to food, housing, jobs, and other things which divert them from their health care.
Yeah, so interesting ideas about apps that help with the role of community health workers in care delivery. Any comments on how to link ideas like that to research data generation on social determinants of health?
I think it's a really good point. I think it's one we need to pay particular attention to, which is the less advantaged or the disadvantaged. And, you know, I think we maybe should look at some of the developing countries and what they're doing. So countries that have moved to mobile technology without having the phone infrastructure and not necessarily using really advanced devices. What have they done? You know, when they've got very high penetration, and I know they're using it in healthcare. So if we look, you know, overseas and see what experience there is, that could help us. But I agree with you. These are high need populations with high potential to benefit. How can we make sure technology can help them? And your experience sounds very interesting.
I think there's good data to say that the technology divide isn't perhaps as great within our country as previously it had been. So I think we're making strides there in terms of what people have in terms of the access to certain technologies. But I think the experience is really different. So we are engaged with a user-centered design firm, and they're actually, I don't mean to speak out of turn for them, but they're working with basic social safety net systems to try to redesign some of their interactions. So I think that there's a great disparity in what people expect from the interaction with technology, with some people's experience being really clunky, not real time, not even close to real time, and other people really having an experience, a very good experience or a very user-friendly experience and designed experience. So thinking about how to even out those systems is important.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, this is Danny with MedTech Insight. This question is actually geared towards more of the FDA side. You know, we're talking about FDA-regulated devices and non-FDA regulated devices when we're talking about consumer devices that are gathering this data. What's the value of this data if it's not FDA-regulated devices that are gathering the data because they're not validated? So if you have multiple heart sensors that are picking up maybe multiple readings, in the end, what does that mean for any sort of product that's developed for the public that FDA would then regulate.
That FDA would or would not regulate?
That FDA would regulate. Let's say you develop, a new drug or something based on the sensor readings that you got. What does that mean for the end product? Because if you're using multiple kinds of heart sensors that are on the consumer market, that they give you different readings, how does that all play in? And I know part of the recommendation is developing standards. If you're developing standards for consumer grade products, does that then does FDA have any say in that? Or is that something that, a separate standard body has to determine that can then be used in gathering the data?
I don't know if you want to comment on that. I'm also going to, looking at Christine, to see if she wants to say something about that, since this is an issue that did come up in the report and is related to our recommendations. But first, go ahead, Martin, and then and you can.
Just quickly, so we obviously faced that kind of issue in the programs we were running. So if I just talk about hypertension, we're managing the individual for systolic blood pressure, and we're going to change medications based on that. So we need to make sure that that data is robust enough, and therefore we used FDA-approved devices for that dimension. It's different we also want them to be more active. Yeah. We also want them to be focusing on their weight to control it. And we were looser about that because the absolute value there is less important. Now, I don't know what the FDA would have to say about it, but in a practical sense, we were differentiating between the information that's used for hard clinical management versus lifestyle behavior change. And that I didn't explain why I think the metadata is important, but you can imagine why, because if I've now put that data into the medical record and I want to go back and use some of those dimensions, I need to know what the provenance was and maybe the context that I collected it. Otherwise, I'm going to get into trouble down the track.
Oh, great. And Christina?
Well, Martin actually did a great job. I think the thing to remember here is sort of multiple spectrums. One is that we think mHealth data has a lot of use in evaluating devices for multiple reasons, not just in the regulatory space. And we think that this mHealth data can actually be grown in other areas before it hits the primary space, for the regulatory space. And in the same way, we talk in the paper a little bit about stepwise validation, where you might use a piece of data as an exploratory outcome and then correlate it with your gold star primary outcome at one stage. And then the next stage, maybe you say, okay, well, now it's a secondary outcome. And now in a bigger study, I validated against that, again, that gold star primary outcome. And so then maybe in the post-market, you've shown that this actually is equivalent. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that this device has been approved by the FDA, but that it is being made within certain standards, and within those standards, it's working.
I was also wondering, since Jeff's sitting right over there, if he has any comments on it as well.
Well, Jeff was not part of this panel, but I don't know if he wants to. He's also not a potted plant, so.
Well, definitely done. I would toss the regulatory issue aside, but I'll tell you from the regulatory side, if you're using a technology to gather information, and even if that is for gathering information for purposes of assessing a device, that's not a medical device. So we don't regulate that technology. But if you're using a technology to assess a technology for purposes of getting it approved, you want to make sure that it is accurate enough that we're going to be able to rely on the data that's generated. That is really the key point. So whether regulated or not regulated, can you have sufficient confidence in the data collected for whatever decision you're going to make, whether that's a regulator, that is a payer, that is a clinician, or a patient.
Thanks for letting me put you on the spot. And again, this is not the first time. mHealth is not the first time that. I know, that's right. We'll work on that next. But mHealth is not the first time that data coming from sources not regulated by the FDA are important or could be important for regulatory decisions. And I would just emphasize that stepwise approach that Christina mentioned that's outlined in the report. Great. Any final thoughts from the panel, other points, issues that you'd like to make sure people leave with in terms of thinking about next steps for mHealth applications in research? Rachel?
I mean, I think the report's great. I think it's a great first step in sort of helping us understand. And I think we've seen from the questions that we're still, there's a lot of questions out there that tap in a lot of different areas. And I think there's still a lot of sort of thinking that we need to do as a sort of overall community to see how we might best use mHealth to improve patients' health, to reduce health disparities, and to keep moving forward.
I would just emphasize the circular loop that mHealth has in terms of patient engagement, that it really has an opportunity to bring people in by creating user-centered designed devices or technologies, but also to educate patients, to give them something back, and that will then feed back into the system. So we know that patients and caregivers want to have that bi-directional relationship as outlined in the action plan, and I think that that will go a long way to widening the stakeholders and making sure that patients and caregivers and other folks, any user of the mHealth devices in the system.
I'd encourage people to start moving and learning and just face the fact that we'll get some things wrong. Got to do that carefully. We don't want to harm patients. I think there's a greater interest and willingness of patients to participate in this. They have a hunger to do this. But we should also recognize that this type of approach doesn't suit all patients, and we shouldn't force it down people's throats. Certain styles, it's just not going to work. And then I would encourage everyone to share information, in particular, what doesn't work. We always tend to publish what does work. I think we can do a better job of being honest about what I've tried and what didn't work and maybe why. We could learn much faster if we share that information too.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, because I'm a social scientist, I'm going to say if we really want it to be meaningful, then we need to make sure that mHealth is measuring something that's relevant to patients. A lot of times folks just want to use a technology or a tool because it's new and it seems cool. Let's make sure that it's meaningful to those patients, it's relevant to their disease, and then we'll have high compliance and we'll be able to generate important data for health outcomes. And then again, I'd say really think about, don't underestimate the value of pre-competitive collaboration. Almost everything we're doing right now in clinical outcome assessments is pre-competitive industry collaboration, and we're able to move 5 times as fast as we did it alone. And it's probably one of the most fulfilling parts, I think, of all of us, for all of us as researchers right now. And so I hope to see analogs of that move into technology in the future.
Well, I want you all to stay seated just for another minute or so, but I do want to thank all of our panelists, plus our special extra panelists, for their comments during this session. Now, you all have heard you've heard a lot about the excitement, the enthusiasm around mHealth, both clinically and for research, in terms of transforming how research is conducted to truly patient-centered health research that lines up with where our healthcare system and our whole approach to promoting health is headed. But you've also heard about a lot of the challenges in getting from the current state of research to this future patient-centered approach in terms of reliable data collection, interpretation, synthesis, and fit-for-purpose use. This is already starting to happen. mHealth is happening now in research. The report describes many of these current existing approaches that can be a foundation for further progress like we've outlined today. And it includes a clear set of recommendations for next steps on implementation to accelerate progress for more meaningful, comprehensive research through practical steps in using mHealth and how to do it in a way that creates value for everyone involved, and particularly confidence, support, and benefits for patients. So I want to give a special thanks to the people who made this report possible, not just some of the panelists that you heard from, but a whole set of advisors, and again, they're listed in the report that put time and effort into putting this together. It was a great working group, and I think they covered an awful lot of ground with the action plan. I think it'll be a useful foundation for moving mHealth forward, as you heard from a number of the comments today. And I also want to thank the many people who graciously shared their perspectives and insights with our team at the Duke Margolis Center as this project came together and as we executed it. And a number of them are here today too, as well as joining us online. And then last but certainly not least, special thanks to the Duke Margolis mHealth team, Isha Sharma, Jonathan Bryan, and particularly Christina Silcox for an excellent job in leading this effort. Thank you all. And I'd like to wish you a good Friday afternoon, a great weekend. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you for your contributions on mHealth and improving patient care.